Welcome to the Lessons from Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Brian Beckcom. My next guest is Nicholas Kalt. After graduation from high school, Nick went to the United States Naval Academy. While there, he was on the club rugby team after switching from football, and he eventually earned All American honors in rugby in 1999. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in Systems Engineering in 2000 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. During a training exercise, Nick had one of his hands blown completely off and the other one badly damaged, but he was able to figure out a way to get through the physical requirements and was eventually sent to Iraq. He was deployed to Iraq in 2004 with the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit. He was a platoon commander for a platoon of combat engineers from the 1st Combat Engineering Battalion. While he was deployed, he received wounds that eventually led to his medical retirement. He retired in 2006 with the rank of captain. He was awarded the Purple Heart, Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V, and the Combat Action Ribbon. Upon leaving the Armed Forces, Nick was hired as a firefighter with the city of Long Beach, California. And for those of you who know, California firefighters have a lot of work to do. In 2015, he was promoted to captain in the firefighting department and married his wife, Katie, the following year. They have one daughter, Lula, and are expecting another baby in 2021, and they live in San Clemente, California. In the podcast, Nick and I talk about what it was like at the United States Naval Academy, what motivated him to get in the military to begin with, his athletic accomplishments, his accident he had during training that resulted in severe injuries, how he was able to stay in the Marine Corps despite what might have been disabling injuries for anybody else, how he went to Iraq, what it was like when he was shot in Iraq and almost died, and then what's been like afterwards. We talked for so long, we didn't get a chance to talk about his firefighting duties, and Nick has agreed to come on another podcast to talk about that because I think being a firefighter in California, particularly during the fire season, is a super cool, interesting story. So we'll talk to Nick about that later. I had a great conversation with Nick. Nick is a true American patriot and hero. He's a distinguished war veteran and is a great guy overall. I hope you enjoy this podcast. And I give you Nicholas Kalt.
Hey everybody, Brian Beckcom, my BB attorneys here. I have Nick Kalt. Nick, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Well, Nick, thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast. I know you got a lot of things going on. Before we get into your background and your story, which is an incredible story, by the way, United States Marine Corps, and then also you've got some great stories about being a firefighter. How you doing, man? I mean, it's kind of a difficult time right now. It's July 2nd, 2020. We're kind of right in the middle of this pandemic. We thought we were going to be okay. You're in California, right?
I am, that's right.
What part of California are you in?
I live in a town called San Clemente, which is about halfway between Los Angeles and San Diego.
And what's the situation with the coronavirus where you're at?
It's interesting. I guess a lot of it depends on who you ask, but from my perspective, the perspective of my family, and I think the perspective of my fire department and sort of the folks that I work with, the perspective is that it's pretty serious. And at this point, I don't think there's any sort of thing that would be an overreaction. The only overreaction is the panic at this point. I think every other step that you can reasonably put in place to be cautious and sort of take care of your fellow man is appropriate. And we're just trying to adhere by that. But all things considered, I think we're doing pretty well. My family being my number one priority here, and then also the guys that I work with. I say guys generically, although my crew is a crew of entirely made up of men. But those are our priorities right now. And I would say that both from the perspective of my work and my family life, that things are going really well. So thanks for asking.
Good. Yeah, good to hear. And you're married and you have kids. How many kids do you have?
So that's an interesting question. I guess dovetails into a portion of the story if you want to talk about it or not. But so my wife and I have one living daughter. Her name is Lula, and she's about 2.5 years old.
Okay.
And then my wife was pregnant last year, and unfortunately we lost the baby just prior to childbirth on November 6th when she was born. She actually found that she passed away on November 4th, and her name was Matilda, and she's no longer with us, unfortunately. But as it turns out, my wife is pregnant again, and we opted to
nice. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Try it again in these sort of uncertain times, and really looking forward to seeing who this next little person and member of our clan is going to be.
Yeah, that's awesome. When my wife, I have 3 kids. I have 2 boys, 16 and 14, and a daughter who's 12. And when we were first getting pregnant, the same thing happened to us, although my wife wasn't quite as far along as it sounds like your wife was. But
yeah.
Well, that's great. So you're 2.5. So I've talked to a number of people on the podcast, Nick, and so having teenagers during a quarantine is one thing. You know, having college students, that's okay because they can kind of do their own thing. Teenagers can kind of do their own thing too. I wouldn't imagine a 2.5-year-old can do their own thing, right? I mean, you've got to pay a lot of attention still.
Yeah.
To a 2.5-year-old, right?
You do, and you know, as time goes along, I think you forget maybe portions of, you know, for example, I'd imagine you maybe forget portions of what it was like to have your kids be 2.5 years old.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah, they require a lot of attention, and my wife and I had a conversation about this. It's like, you know, where do you draw the line between letting them initiate their own play and, you know, do their own thing, and then really, you know, paying a lot of love and attention to them. And it's an interesting time now because I think we're fortunate in a certain sense in that we haven't really had to explain to her, you know, what COVID-19 is, what the effects of it are, because at this point, I think it's just so far beyond her grasp that she wouldn't really understand it even if we did try to approach it. Although I have explained in very simplistic terms that people are getting sick and things of that nature. But so I think we have the benefit of not having to fully explain it to her. But at the same time, we wonder about what she's missing out on as far as interaction with other human beings, really, you know, because again, we're trying to be very cautious, not only, you know, for our own health and safety, but also maybe more so at this point in terms of kind of our obligation to society and what that expectation is. So we don't do the things with her that we normally do, even if that's just taking her to the grocery store or, you know, over to the hardware store to buy some stuff, or, you know, to the playground like we normally would, things like that, and just her association with other kids. And, you know, I kind of wonder what that's going to mean for her in the long term. In the short term, she seems incredibly happy to just hang out with us. Yeah, we're happy. I don't want to say it's a good thing, but we're getting a lot of quality family time out of it.
I'm so glad you said that, because every guest I've talked to so far has children, and I always ask how they're doing, especially during the quarantine times. And one of the things I've noticed, and you know, there's a lot of really negative stuff about the coronavirus, the pandemic, the protests we're having, the economy. But if you're going to look at things from the most positive perspective you can, I've got to spend more quality time with my 3 kids who are teenagers than I have in a very, very long time. And so, you know, that's a little bit of a positive. But I'll tell you what, you know, one thing you just said kind of made me think, with a 2.5-year-old child, and for instance, with my kids, you know, you and I, and nobody living that I'm aware of it has ever been through anything like this. We haven't had a pandemic like this since, I think, 1918 or 1919.
Right.
And so this is new for everybody. But for kids that are 2.5, or even for my kids to some extent, you know, I think about how they're not going to know any different. Like, they're going to grow up in a world that has been changed dramatically by this pandemic, and it's just going to be the new normal to them. And so, you know, it's tough because, you know, my 16-year-old, for instance, he's going to be a junior in high school, and he's supposed to play basketball this year.
Right.
And I have some real concerns about whether basketball season's even going to happen. And, you know, he'll get another chance when he's a senior, but you know, these seniors in high school, all of them across the country that are playing sports or in the band or whatever, they may not get to enjoy their senior year. And, you know, you think about that kind of, it's a little bit depressing, but these kids are so resilient. They'll I think they'll get through it. But, well, Nick, so tell us a little bit about where you're from, where you grew up,
Sure,
where you went to high
absolutely.
school, stuff like that.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My parents, Chris and Joy, been married, man, I guess 45 years now. They still live in the Milwaukee area. I've got one younger brother, Vince, who's 41 now. He's got 3 kids of his own. They still live in the area. And then, I grew up there, went to high school in a local kind of a small public high school called Shorewood High School, which is in kind of one of the immediately northern suburbs of the Milwaukee area. About midway through high school, I discovered that I was interested in pursuing a career in military service. So I decided to go to the Naval Academy in Annapolis. Did 4 years there. As I mentioned to you previously, I got a degree in systems engineering, which I've never used since. And the military does a really good job of training you for one thing and then using you for something entirely different. But yeah, joined the Marines. After that, I got a commission as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. Joined the Marines. Was stationed out in California in Camp Pendleton, which happens to be just really jogging distance from my back door here in San Clemente, which is, part of the reason I bought my house here and sort of decided to settle down here was I was stationed, really just a stone's throw away. Served in the Marines from 2000 to 2006. Got out in 2006. Kind of went on, I would call it maybe like a little bit of a walkabout or vision quest for about a year and a half, 2 years.
Nice.
And found my way into the fire service. Got very lucky to be hired in 2008 in the city of Long Beach. Been working there since 2008. Really loved that career and sort of what it's provided not only for me but for my family as well. And then as far as my family's concerned, my wife Katie and I have been married since 2016. And like I said, we got our one daughter Lula, who's 2.5, and our other daughter Matilda, who would have been about 8 months old right now, but isn't with us. And another little bun in the oven.
Awesome. Well, congratulations for the third bun in the oven. That's really cool. So let's talk about. So you know what I found with a lot of you Marines is you guys tend to be pretty modest. So
my wife was telling me about this just before my coming on here. So
yeah,
I know you're getting that.
Yeah. So you've got such an impressive life story, and you kind of went through it very quickly. So let's talk a little bit about, because I know there's going to be people listening. For instance, there'll be people who may have kids that want to go to a military academy, or there may be teenagers listening to the podcast that are interested in going into one of the military academies. So tell us about what was it? Do you remember, was it something specific when you were in high school or some other time earlier than that where you said, you know what, I feel like I want to get in the military? What was it that made you say, I want to go to the U.S. Naval Academy?
Sure. So specific reasons for wanting to go to the Naval Academy. I think there are a number of reasons. My introduction to the school was from an older guy who's 2 years ahead of me in high school. And he and I were both on the football and track and field team together. And he was a guy I looked up to and admired. And he had gone to something called the Summer Seminar in Annapolis, which is essentially, I think it's a 1 week, kind of like a summer camp, where they kind of initiate you. You actually get to spend time on the campus. And so he came back from his summer seminar, which I think would have taken place probably his junior year, so my freshman year in high school. And I just remember the way he talked about it. And again, he's a guy that I held in very high regard, and the degree of interest that he demonstrated from the summer seminar, I was like, man, that's something really interesting to me. I think, again, there were a handful of reasons that made me want to go there. Ultimately, I had considered kind of an educational background in engineering ever since I was really little. I loved to take things apart, put them back together, see how they worked. I think in my mind's eye, I had a really romantic idea of what engineering was about. And I knew that the Naval Academy had a great engineering school. I had a background in athletics, played football, basketball, track and field, and baseball, even at the high school level, and wanted to be able to continue that athletic pursuit. And I was actually recruited by the football team to play football there. And then I think first and foremost, the concept of service, and the idea that I would be able to serve my country, although I didn't understand maybe in what capacity at that point, was probably the leading reason. Although, I think all of those things played a factor in going there. The summer seminar was great. I ended up doing it in my junior year, and it really kind of hammered home my desire to go to school there. Yeah, absolutely no regrets as far as doing it, and would be happy to speak to any high schooler or even younger, someone who's looking to maybe do that as a career choice moving forward. But I absolutely loved it. And the thing that's interesting about the Naval Academy versus a trade school, or what some might consider like a normal college education, is that it's like a separate path, and you can't walk them all at the same time. You can maybe go back and go to college later, or maybe go back and learn a trade later. But at the time that I went to the Naval Academy, it was a very conscious decision that, hey, this is the path that I'm going down, and I'm sort of willing and able to do that.
Yeah, and if you're not serious about the military academies, it's probably not going to happen, because this would have been in the kind of early to mid 90s.
Yeah,
that you were there. Yeah,
96 to 2000.
96 to 2000. So this is before 9/11, and I think it's fair to say this was during a time of relative peace and stability in the world. So in other words, when you went to the Naval Academy, we weren't in war in the Middle East. I mean, and a matter of fact, we didn't even, there was no expectation that there would be any war in the Middle East.
No.
And it was kind of like that when I was at A&M too, and I was in the Corps of Cadets for 4 years with Toby. There was no, I mean, there was little hot spots here and there, but there were no major campaigns. There were no major wars anywhere in the world.
Sure.
But so when you tell people, because you said something earlier, you said something about if anybody, any high school kids or anybody wants to talk about the process of getting into the military academies, you'd be happy to talk to them. So talk to them now. Like, let's say I'm a freshman going into high school, or a sophomore going into high school, and I want to go to West Point, or I want to go to the U.S. Naval Academy. And that's a goal of mine. What kind of things would you recommend that I do as a high school, freshman or sophomore, to put myself in the best position to get admitted to one of the military academies?
Sure. So let me backtrack just a second. I'm taking notes here too, Brian, so that I can make sure I hit questions that you have for me. You talked about a couple things that I want to touch on, to include stability, right? You talked about at the time that I joined the Naval Academy, the geopolitical scene in the United States involvement in it was one that seemed relatively stable, right? And I know we're talking about living through some unstable times right now. And so I'd like to kind of talk about the concept of stability, and how that might affect a young person's decision really to do anything in this world, whether it's to pursue a career in the military, or a spot at one of the service academies, or really to, pick a job, or a career, or a calling, a spouse, whatever. The decision to have children moving forward during times that may seem unstable. I think when I decided to go to the Naval Academy, it was a very stable time, and I lived a life of privilege up to the point when I was 18, where I grew up in a middle class house that we certainly weren't rich, but I never wanted for food on the table or anything like that.
Can I ask you something, Nick? Not to interrupt you, but do you have any military? Do you have a history of military participation in your family, or like
my grandfathers, both on my mom's and dad's side, were in the Army, kind of in the World War II time frame. They were both on the very young end of the spectrum to be participants in World War II. I know my grandfather on my mom's side went to England and never made it as far as Germany, although they were prepared to go to Germany when he was, I think, 17 or 18 years old.
Wow.
My parents have no history of military service, nor do any of my aunts and uncles. It was just all kind of the 2 generations removed from my grandparents.
And the reason I ask is because I come from a military family. My dad's a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, flew 200 combat missions over Vietnam.
Yeah.
My grandfather, who's now deceased, he was actually in the Army he was in the U.S. Army Air Corps before there was even an Air Force. And then when they started the Air Force, he moved over to the Air Force. My mom was an Air Force nurse. My uncle was Air Force enlisted man.
Wow.
And I've got a long history of military involvement. And I ended up becoming a lawyer. And I have no lawyers in my family. So it's almost like I was intentionally doing something
Sure.
that nobody in my family had done. So that's the reason I ask you the question, because a lot of people, I think, they grow up in military families, and so they naturally gravitate towards the military lifestyle.
Understood.
That wasn't necessarily your case, though, right?
No, and so going back to the, kind of the handful of reasons that I decided to go to the Naval Academy, my parents both, I think, instilled into me a value of service. My mom was a nurse, and my dad was a beer salesman, which is arguably one of the greatest services.
Great service.
known to man, yeah. But the concept of service was very strong in both of them, both in their professional lives and in just how we lived our lives daily. And I think, again, that was kind of the, when any young person is deciding what direction they want to go with their life, it was a major factor in me deciding to join the military, to go to the Naval Academy, but also to join the fire service. And so,
it's interesting, Nick, again, not to interrupt you there, but it wasn't until I'm 47 now. And it wasn't until about the time I was maybe in my late 30s that I finally realized something about life. And that's that it wasn't all about me. Like my job, I finally realized that my job here on earth was not to do everything I could for myself, but to do what I could do for my kids, for my family, for my friends, for my community. Sure. It sounds like you had that service mentality at a much younger age, and that you attribute that to your parents.
I do. And I don't mean to put the cart in front of the horse, because I don't know if I recognized it as maybe as altruistic as you're making it out to be as a young man. I think looking back on it, now I'm 42, rapidly approaching 43. And when I think about my desire for service, which is something that I thought very specifically about when I decided my career in the fire service. I think when I was much younger, it was less formed or maybe less polished, less understood by me. But I think the concept existed. And what's neat about the concept of service and the manner in which I provided it, both in the military and then now in the fire service, is that, again, the fire service and the military benefited me greatly, because they were a niche where I fit. Both allow me a level of camaraderie, the ability to work with my hands, the ability to test myself physically and mentally, the ability to utilize teamwork, which are all things that both of those job sets require of you. And to me, that's what turns my wheels. They have the added benefit of, I think, on their outward appearance, and as something, if I want to approach it in the way that makes me most effective at my job, that have an altruistic nature to them as well, right? Because ultimately your goal should be the service of other people. And just in the way that your career provides a service to people as well, right? And really any career, you can kind of spin it that way. And so kind of going back towards, the mentorship of a young kid who maybe wants to go to the Naval Academy or wants to learn a trade or whatever they want to do, right? It's, I would encourage kids not to join a service industry. And I say service industry loosely, but I use it in terms of, like the fire service or the military, but pursue what it is that you desire as a young person, and that is something that makes you positive and makes you happy on a daily basis, and then find out what it is about those things that are altruistic and benefit other people.
Nice. Love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
So I chose to go to the Naval Academy again because of all those reasons that we've already discussed.
And what would you tell the kids? Because I interrupted there. You were talking about what you would tell the high school kids. If you want to go to a military academy, here's the things you should be thinking about. Here's the things you should be doing.
Well, so number one, I think, is exposure, right? I had this this grandiose idea of what the Naval Academy was, what a degree in engineering meant, what it meant to play college football. And then I think a lot of those things don't necessarily stand up to the test of experiencing them firsthand.
Yeah.
And so this summer seminar, along with, multiple visits that I did not only to the Naval Academy, but to other schools, exposed me to what life there would really be like as an engineering student, as a football player, as a new freshman, which we call plebes at the Naval Academy, which is a real eye-opener if you haven't been there and experienced it, right? Because it can kind of make you tail and run
For sure.
if you're not prepared for it. And so I think exposure would be the number one thing. I'm not sure kind of what level of exposure the Naval Academy or really any other schools are having for incoming students now with COVID-19, but if you can educate yourself, whether that's through online videos or talking to people that have sort of been there and done that, I think that's the number one thing. I think the number two thing would be that, and this is a hard concept even for us to grasp as 40-something years old, is the concept of stability. And that, again, when I joined the Naval Academy, it was a time of relative peace and relative inactivity for our nation's military overseas. But in the blink of an eye, those things can change. And I think with the realization that change is a part of normal life, whether it's change due to the coronavirus or civil unrest or, unrest overseas, that part of what the Naval Academy does, part of what the fire service does, part of what, even you exposing yourself to more of these things as you grow up as, a young kid, is it prepares you for that change. And the notion that you're going to go to a place like the Naval Academy and it's going to be just like the experience that I had is different now, right? Because like you said, the world has changed dramatically and probably semi-permanently for your kids who are in high school. And the expectation is that, and I think a reasonable expectation for any person in this day and age is that change will continue. The tenets of what you value as a person and what makes you tick, and then the tenets of service to others, if those are things that drive you, then I would highly encourage you to seek out those opportunities, whether that's at the Naval Academy or someplace else.
So number one piece of advice for parents of children that are interested in the military academies or kids that are interested in military academies is expose yourself as much as you can to what you're going to be getting into.
100%. And that's important. I'll say that that's important for the students and the aspiring attendees of the Naval Academy, but I think it's really important for the parents as well.
Absolutely. Great point. That's a great point. Yeah.
I know.
So like when I got in the Corps of Cadets, my dad was in the Corps of Cadets and my granddad was in the Corps of Cadets. So my dad knew what I was getting into, so he didn't have to be there. But a lot of parents, like you're saying, that don't know anything about the military academy, the Corps of Cadets, or what have you, would be shocked about some of the things that their kids have to go through, right? And so that's a great point. You want the parents should be exposed to what it's like 100%. As well. But so other than being exposed to what it's going to be like to the extent you can. So for instance, you talked about the summer program in the Naval Academy. At the Corps of Cadets at A&M, we have what's called Spend the Night with the Corps. Where you can actually go and stay the night with an outfit and stay the whole day, see what it's like. So similar deal. But other than the exposure, what I've noticed, Nick, is that the military academies, at least historically, have always tended to want people that were well-rounded, like athletes, scholars, or other extracurricular stuff. Is that? And you were a very high-level athlete in high school, and I think you were actually an All American Rugby player in college too, weren't you?
I was, although it's not like being an All American college football player. You got to understand that the scale of rugby in the United States is still
that's impressive. But so you were a basketball, football, and track guy in high school, and
right.
Would you recommend to kids that are interested in military academies to have some either athletic pursuits or other extracurricular pursuits?
Yeah, well, certainly it would help. And I think you're right in that the military academy does look for well-rounded individuals. So if I can touch on one point as far as admissions is concerned real quick, and then we'll go on to talking about how, someone might make themselves a bit more well-rounded. I think you need a letter of recommendation in order to attend the Naval Academy or any of the service academies. this letter has to come from a U.S. senator, congressman, or congresswoman, or from the vice president, is my understanding, right?
Yeah. So for people that are listening, and I think it's still like this, Nick, but when you and I were in high school applying to colleges, you literally had to have a sitting U.S. congressman, senator, vice president write you a letter of recommendation.
Exactly.
How do you even get that? I mean, how does that happen?
Well, so great question. And I think this is another important thing for aspiring students and parents is that every congressperson, every senator does it differently. They each have an allocation of, I believe, 5 appointments at any given time.
Wow.
I made the rounds. I went to my local senator and congresspeople, and some of them interviewed me personally, and some of them had a panel of people that they appointed within the community to interview me. Bottom line is they wanted to interview me. And at that point, it becomes pretty competitive, right? And so at this point, you're trying to be well-rounded, right? You're trying to appear like a person that this congressperson or senator wants to have representing them at a service academy, right? This is my contingent from, in my case, Wisconsin, that's going to be the face of Wisconsin at the United States Naval Academy. And so those people probably want to see some diversity, some mixture of background, and someone who's going to represent them well, ultimately. I think in order to make yourself well-rounded and appear as that well-rounded individual, not only to these interview panels, but to the admissions committee at the Naval Academy, like you said, a background in athletics is helpful. Number one, because there's a physical standard that you have to meet when you go to the Naval Academy. I think it's easier for them to say, oh, this person probably wouldn't have any problem meeting the physical standard because they, ran track in high school or whatever. But the other thing
and also being part of a team, most sports, you got to be part of a team. You got to put
100%.
the team's interest above your own. And that's exactly what you learn in the military. For the
100%. But again, my argument would be to a young person that's in high school is that if you're not involved in athletics, that doesn't preclude you from applying.
Right.
If you're not interested in organized athletics, that doesn't mean that you're not going to make a good Naval and Marine Corps officer. What I would say is look at the things that you do enjoy doing, whether it's student government or, Students Against Social Apathy or whatever.
Yeah. Eagle Scout, if you want to do stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But try and evaluate those things that you do and that you like to do and how they would benefit, the Naval Academy, or how they would benefit operating in a team environment, how they would benefit society as a person who is dedicating their life and their career to a career of service. And then I think once you start evaluating those things that you're already good at, number one, that might open the door for you to try something new that maybe you didn't realize would be an interest of yours. But number two, I think it allows you to go in front of an interview panel and say, hey, this makes me a more well-rounded individual because X, Y, and Z.
And I tell people as a business owner, I say that I will absolutely, if somebody has high-level athletic achievements, be it high school, college, I will absolutely give them an interview. That will absolutely, in my mind, as somebody making a hiring decision, be a big plus, a big check mark in the plus category. But it's not just athletics, Nick, like you said. If I see somebody as an Eagle Scout, I know automatically that they know the value of hard work, that they know how to plan, that they know how to work as a team, that there's just certain or even if you're in the band, let's say you're in the band in high school and you're the head drum major or something, that shows me as a business owner that you're able to do things beyond just school. Like you're able to plan, show initiative, be a teamwork, a member of a team. And so I think part of this Naval Academy requirement to be a well-rounded person is awesome. So when you get to the Naval Academy, for real, what was your experience like? Was it what you expected? Was it better, worse, different?
It was. So it's super challenging as a freshman, or what we call plebes. And, you're treated as sort of the lowest of the low, and I think, evaluating, hey, what am I good at and why do I do the things that I like to do and how do they dovetail into a career of service? It allows you an opportunity for self-evaluation, as does, your plebe year and really your whole time at the Naval Academy. Again, it's a completely separate experience than what I would consider, like a trade or a normal college experience would be like, in that it really puts you to the test, physically, mentally. The system is designed to place a lot of pressure upon you, right?
Yeah, sure.
To make decisions, to conduct time management, and to do a lot of these things that, frankly, a lot of high schoolers haven't had to do, because, like myself, you know, I grew up with, hey, get good grades, you know, participate in sports, and kind of things will work themselves out. And now it's like, hey, I'm not going to have time enough to do everything that I need to get accomplished in the middle of the day. How do I get it all done? How do I prioritize them? They hammer it home through physical exertion, through, you know, life skills and mental stressors, to put it nicely. And it's a bit of a shock to the system, coming from, you know, a high school environment where you're kind of, in my case, you know, maybe a bit of a big fish in a small pond.
Right.
And I think it was really good for me. And I'd encourage others to do it as well.
You know, when I went to college, Nick, I was kind of similar to you in terms of my high school career. I made good grades. I was a pretty high level basketball player, you know, went to state finals, all district, that sort of thing. And then I went to A&M and I played basketball for A&M my first year. And you said something earlier about how college sports, or the college experience, it was good for the parents to see what it was like too. And I tell people all the time, especially parents, college sports compared to high school sports, there's no comparison. It is such a business. It is not what it's like in high school. And so it was a little bit of a shock to me as well. And then I joined the Corps after my freshman year. I stopped playing basketball and I joined the Corps, and it was the same deal. I had so much stuff to do outside of just school. You had to figure out how to plan it, when you were going to do this, when you were going to do that. But those kind of skills, those what I'll call executive skills or meta skills, those are the kind of skills you carry throughout your whole life, right?
I agree.
Dealing with stress and stuff like that. So let's talk real quick, because you were, again, I think a little bit too modest about being an All American Rugby player. So
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so rugby to me was a beautiful thing. It's a sport that I'd never played before, and I would say, with the exception of marrying my wife and having our children, has been probably the most taken as an individual effort, formative experience of my life. I went to the Naval Academy expecting to play football. Discovered, as it sounds like maybe you did as well, that I was now a very small fish in a big pond.
Yeah, it's not, college sports is not what when you're in high school, you have one idea of it. And then, I mean, for example, I tell people, since I played basketball, we played over the Christmas holidays. I didn't get to go home during Christmas my freshman year. I was literally living in a dorm where I was the only person in a 500 person dorm. And that was the kind of sacrilege. And that's just a small example of the differences. But anyway, you were talking about rugby and how cool it was, or, you know, how football was different than rugby. So keep going there.
Yeah. So my football career, you know, I was a tight end in high school, and at the time the Naval Academy offense didn't utilize a tight end. And so they converted me to defensive end. I was not fast enough to play the position. So then they put me in an offensive tackle. At the time I weighed probably 205 pounds soaking wet, you know. So, but they had a guy who's a year older than me who, you know, eventually went on to play with both the Green Bay Packers and the Panthers, who had made a similar transition, and ended up getting a Super Bowl ring. And I think they envisioned kind of the same type of thing for me. Well, I sort of read the handwriting on the wall, and it's like, man, I got to put on almost 100 pounds here, and then also still be expected to move around. And meanwhile, this guy is still only a year ahead of me, so I'm on the depth chart behind a guy who's an eventual, you know,
Super Bowl
champion, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, then I actually made it through spring ball, and it's a grist mill, right? You're in the mornings doing your workouts, at noon doing
6
your
a.m.
video, and then after school doing your practice. Meanwhile, my grades are suffering a little bit, and so it just wasn't. I made it past spring ball, and I made the cut to continue playing, but I read the handwriting on the wall, and it looked like, man, I probably won't even really get significant playing time until I'm a senior, and that's if I'm really minding my P's and Q's and kind of kicking ass and doing the things that I need to do. And another buddy of mine who had played defensive end as a freshman had decided to quit and went over to the rugby team, and kind of made me a convert. And man, I went over there and it was like somebody turned on the light bulb, but it was, I think,
That's
much
awesome.
more suited to, man, it was such a great experience. And I think it was more suited to the type of athleticism I was used to, which was more running around, more, I think on the fly and innovative, as opposed to having a set play in your mind of what you had to do. And really, I think more fast paced, and the guys that were doing it, I think, for the love of sport and for the love of the game in particular, which I didn't even have a concept of, right? I knew none of the rules going in.
Yeah. It's interesting, you know, Bill Belichick, you talk about love of the sport. I read something that Bill Belichick said that he likes to hire guys that played Division III football. Because he said, if you play Division III football, you must really love the sport, right?
Right.
You're really into football. So,
yep.
So you get into rugby, and we could have a whole nother podcast about rugby. I mean,
Sure.
When I think of rugby, I think of those. Is it Australia or New Zealand? Is it the black and tans or the?
Yeah, New Zealand's the All Blacks.
Yeah, the All Blacks. Yeah, and they do that awesome. Are they the ones that do the thing right before the game starts?
They do a haka dance.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's so cool. So you get into rugby, and by the end, did you play 4 years of rugby?
I played 3. So after my freshman year, I made it through spring ball of football and decided, it's really not for me. And at the outset of my sophomore year, I started playing.
Nice. And then you were eventually an All American.
I was, yeah.
Awesome, nice. And then never played in high school. In 3 years, you're an All-American.
Never played in high school. No, that was what was interesting, and that's why I kind of say it's not maybe nearly as impressive as you're giving me credit for to be a college All-American in rugby. Is that, you know, everybody plays. Well, I shouldn't say everybody, but almost every high school in the nation has a high school football team. You know, there are Pop Warner football teams, grade school football teams, where it's very seldom that you see a Pop Warner rugby team. It's becoming more common, especially out here on the West Coast, but really rare to see, and even rare to see a lot of really well-established high school football programs. And you being in Texas, I'm sure know, you know, just how significant high school football is.
We got high school football stadiums that are twice the size of Division I college football stadiums.
Yeah, exactly. And we're consistently one of the top 4 rugby teams in the nation, and we're not bringing in any money for the school. We're not selling any merchandise or drawing fans to the stadium. You know, they're like packing the audience. Is just not really heard of in this day and age. And I'm hopeful that maybe someday it will be. But part of the nice thing about that, Brian, is that I was still allowed to play it essentially for the love of the game. You know, there was no pressure to be anything other than what we were, which was kind of I don't want to say a bad news bears, but it was kind of this conglomeration of guys who had previously played soccer or basketball or football, or maybe heard about rugby or played it a little bit, and you throw us all together, and man, what an awesome mixture, not only of teamwork and camaraderie, but just friendship. And really the sport was sort of in such a fledgling state, at least at the college level when I played, that it was still, you could still go on tour we went on a tour to Ireland, I think it was my sophomore, junior year. And it was like, you could still go to Ireland, you know, play at a really high level, and then go have a pint in the pub afterwards, and no one looks sideways at you, because it's all part of the culture, you know?
Nice.
Whereas I think if you were found doing that as a high level college football player, there would be questions of, hey, why is this guy drinking a beer during the season? And, you know, what do his teammates think about, and all that kind of stuff. And we were really allowed to, I think, experience rugby, not only here, but also overseas, with kind of a lot of the traditions that have been in place for decades, and to do some of the stuff that I think was really fun to do as a college athlete.
That's super cool. You know, the reason I stopped playing college basketball, Nick, was because I played basketball for basically 5 years of my life, all the way through high school and my first year of college. Every single day, 365 days a year, I was totally obsessed. Sure. Then I got to college. We had a kind of a tough season, but it was just, I was just worn out. And I told my dad, I said, I'm just not enjoying myself anymore. So I'm going to join the Corps of Cadets. So I put down my basketball, and I didn't pick a basketball up for a year. And then I picked it up again. I started playing intramurals and started playing for the love of the game. And I not only had a much, much better time, I was actually a better basketball player after I had taken some time off. But well, that's great, Nick. So Well, let's talk about, so after, basically everybody that goes to a military academy has to take a military commission of some sort when they graduate, right? So
Yep.
you graduated, I think you said in 2000.
That's right.
And so this is before 9/11, and are you commissioned as a naval officer or Marine officer?
Yeah. So at the graduation, it usually takes place May or June, and at that point, everyone goes from being in the United States Navy to those who have selected a Marine Corps commission as their career in service are now commissioned in the United States Marine Corps, which is technically still falls under the Department of the Navy.
Part of the Navy,
yeah, separate branch, but still falls under the Department of the Navy.
Okay, so you're commissioned as a second lieutenant.
That's right.
And then tell us about the time between when you're first commissioned, how the Marine Corps, I assume you had to go to officer candidate school, or did you do that as part of the Naval Academy?
No, so interestingly, and this is one of the very few exceptions, you don't go to OCS as a Naval Academy graduate.
Okay.
OCS is designed to be an indoctrination, both physical and mental. And I think that, and this might be a gross exaggeration of what national policy is, but I think the thought is that you get that initiation at the Naval Academy.
That's right. So
if you go to OCS coming from a private university, that's one path that you can go through. And then OCS serves as your indoctrination as an officer. And then from the Naval Academy perspective, your plebe year and then all your 4 years at the Naval Academy serve as your indoctrination. And so when graduates of OCS from a private university and graduates from the Naval Academy finally meet up is at a school called TBS, right?
The basic school. Yeah,
exactly. And the basic school is designed to train every Marine Corps officer to act in the capacity of an infantry officer, right? Whether you're a logistician or a pilot or an infantry officer, they teach you all the basic skills to be an infantry officer. 6 months long, takes place in Quantico, Virginia. And then so you've got this batch of second lieutenants coming from OCS, right? And typically they're people who have gone to, say, A&M, for instance, or maybe University of Oregon, all over the country, right? And then they have this very compressed, very condensed indoctrination period at OCS, which, not having gone through it myself, my understanding is that it's pretty exacting, both physically and mentally. And then you've got this other group who's a much smaller cohort coming from the Naval Academy, and they've gone through a much more, I guess you'd say, stretched out indoctrination, where it's very intense that freshman year. And then a lot of the, kind of the reins get loosened up a little bit, if you will. And then I had a fairly, I don't want to say normal college experience, but I was playing rugby. I was going to my classes, living life as a college student, when a lot of these other folks are going through OCS and really getting put through the grist mill for the first time. Yeah. And so eventually we meet up at TBS, and I think a lot of the graduates from OCS were kind of like, man, who are these guys coming into TBS with, kind of like long hair and maybe a little bit more of a relaxed attitude. And the nice thing about TBS was it takes everybody, regardless of your starting point, and kind of puts a little bit of a finish on you as far as what the expectation of a military officer is.
Nice. And I was talking to Blake Sawyer, who's a friend of Toby and I on the podcast, and he said basically at TBS, you're either pilot or infantry. Those are
right
essentially
up until
the two
they
choices.
do the big shuffle. You're pilot or you're ground.
Yeah,
so
that's what he
when
said.
You're a pilot,
you're
guaranteed your contract, right? If you're a pilot, you've got all the physical prerequisites to include. At the time, you had to have 20/20 vision, right? You couldn't have all these other problems that I personally had that disqualified me from being a pilot. And then on the other side, you've got the ground element, which you can go infantry, but you can do all these other things too, to include logistics, combat engineer, which is what I did, a whole slew of other things too.
So you get out of the Naval Academy, and then you go to TBS, and then you become a combat engineer.
Right.
What does a combat engineer do?
So a combat engineer we serve 4 primary functions: mobility, counter mobility, survivability, and general engineering. In the grand scheme of things, the Marine Corps is based upon the fundamental base unit being the Marine Corps Rifle Company or the Marine Corps Rifle Platoon, and every other supporting function is designed to support the Marine Corps Rifle Company Platoon in their operations. Combat engineers are designed to provide them with those 4 basic functions. Mobility, so basically if a rifle company or platoon is moving forward in the offensive, we provide mobility by removing obstacles, whether those obstacles are, minefield or barbed wire, anything in between, we do it. Counter mobility is doing the exact opposite, right? We're putting up obstacles to prevent the enemy's movement and freedom of movement in order to affect their will upon us. Survivability is just basically hardening our defensive positions. In my case in Iraq, it involved a lot of vehicle checkpoints, hardening the exteriors of our forward operating bases, and providing additional structural support to a lot of the overhead protection from mortar fire and artillery fire, stuff like that. And then general engineering, which is not something that I really dabbled in too much. It's more of a function of larger engineering groups, involves, bridge building, and really like the more significant engineering capacity that someone like Toby is probably a lot more familiar with than someone like I am.
So you get out of TBS, you become a combat engineer. At this point, has 9/11 happened?
No, it is not. So after TBS, you go to your military occupational specialty school. In my case, that was Combat Engineer School. TBS about 6 months long. Combat Engineer School, I think at the time was about 4.5 months. So I checked into my unit here in Southern California. I believe it was probably about June of 2001. So very short time thereafter 9/11 took place.
And here's why I'm asking the question, Nick, because I've talked to Blake Sawyer, who I don't think you know, and then Toby, who you know well, and both of those guys graduated from college and then went off into the workforce, and then 9/11 happened, and then they joined the military. And there's a lot of people that did that. I actually think there ought to be a name or a label or something for people that did that. You're coming at it from a different perspective. You are in the military. You have gone through the Naval Academy. You've gone through TBS. You've gone through combat engineering training. And again, like we talked about earlier, no expectations of there being a war anytime soon, right?
Right.
I mean, I would think you would just think, I'm going to do my job. I'm going to learn how to be a combat engineer. I'm going to do what I need to do. And then at some point I'll get out and go into the private sector. Fair to say?
Yes.
And then, boom, 9/11 happens. And so from the perspective, I'm curious to hear, because I've heard a couple times the perspective of civilians who 9/11 happened and that motivated them to get in the military. I want to hear the perspective of an officer who was in the military.
Sure.
And then, boom, 9/11 happened. What goes through your mind when that happens?
Absolutely. Let me touch back on a point too, because we talked about folks who might be interested in attending the Naval Academy. We talked about the concept of stability. Obviously, 9/11 is a huge destabilizing force. And truthfully, I thought was going to be the major destabilizing force in our world and certainly in our country, at least during my lifetime. Turns out probably not the case. But to the degree that it affected the stability of our nation and our military's involvement overseas, it was something that I wasn't necessarily prepared for. But again, I would advise young people that, really the purpose that our military serves is to serve our national interests overseas. And destabilizing events like this happen. And at the end of the day, when you raise your right hand to take that oath, the expectation is that you may be called to do something of this nature, right? And so I think it's just a real important consideration. And parents, like we talked about, to have for kids possibly deciding to join up. As far as my experience when 9/11 happened, I know everybody has their own, hey, I was here when story when it did happen. Looking at it from a perspective that's now almost 20 years removed, is that 9/11 to the degree that it was a very terrible event, and we would hope that nothing like that ever repeats itself, is a validation for the training and really for the purpose and I don't know how much that makes a lot of sense to people. And one of the other analogies I use is that on a daily basis at the firehouse, we train to combat structure fires, right? We train to put out fires that occur in people's homes, not only to save their lives, but to protect their property. And even though we hope and wish that that never befalls anyone, the reality of our world is that it does happen. And that when it does, we are as capable as possible to answer that call. And I think that firefighters, in general, we like to fight fires and we like to go to fires, certainly not because people lose or potentially are placed in danger, but because it's a validation of the things that we do on a daily basis. And again, you and I have talked about, sorry, I'll finish this up real quick, but again, we talk about all those things like teamwork, critical decision-making, athletic ability, right? And those all combine to make me not only a Marine Corps officer, but a firefighter. When you have the opportunity to validate those things in what is really the most challenging possible arena, it inspires me personally. And then the opportunity to hopefully do good for other people through that channel is something it's unbeatable in my mind.
Yeah, and the reason one of the reasons I'm curious about this, Nick, is because, for instance, when I talked to Blake and Toby, who joined after 9/11, I mean, they joined the Marine Corps. They were virtually guaranteed to go to a combat zone. Like they chose the branch of the military and jobs in the military that would virtually, and they said they wanted to go. I mean, Blake and Toby, I wanted to go. I wanted to see what it was like. For people like you that were already in the military, that's not necessarily, I mean, you did sign up for it in a way, but when you signed up, you didn't know that you were actually going to go to battle. And so I'm real curious to know, I would imagine there were some people that were like, hey, this is not really what I necessarily signed up for. And then there were probably other people that were like, okay, now I get to test my skills and my training and see if what I've been doing will work in the real world. So were you kind of one of those guys like, I'm ready to go? Like,
yeah. And I think in the lead up to that time frame, Brian, to answer your question, in between the time when I eventually deployed in 2004 to 2001, there's a pretty long time frame in there where it's like, hey, what is actually going to happen when I see combat? How will I react? Yeah. And I give huge credit to people like Toby who decided to sign up knowing full well what was at stake. And that's again why I tell young people and their parents, hey, really consider this, because this is potentially what you're signing up for, right?
That's right.
From my perspective, you go into it really wondering how you're gonna stack up, right? And I think it was a great leadership challenge for me to know that I had Marines and sailors in my charge who all of a sudden, the situation in the world changes and they're like, I don't know, and that's a huge challenge for a leader.
For sure.
The other interesting part is like a lot of people are seeking out that combat scenario, not necessarily for the accolades, and certainly, at least hopefully, not from the perspective of, hey, I want to injure or kill someone else, another human being, but from the perspective of how do I measure up, right? And how do I face the challenge? And interestingly, about what varies between the time when I signed up versus the time that Toby signed up, and the fact that we were roommates really in Iraq for some time, is that you go overseas and the level of tests that you face or the level of involvement that you have is still largely up to chance. You might sit in the COC and that is your ordered place of duty every day, and you might never see someone actually shooting at you. You might actually get shot at and shoot at someone else and never have the close face-to-face personal interaction. You might be up close and personal in hand-to-hand combat with someone. And I think a lot of people, maybe sign up with the expectation of, especially if it's in wartime, of like, man, I'm really going to go out there and I'm going to test myself. And then you end up driving a computer, you know what I mean? It might be stateside. It might be in Europe somewhere. It might be, Iraq, Afghanistan, who knows, you know?
And nowadays you might be you might be sitting in a building in South Dakota flying Raptors over
100%,
Yemen, right?
100%.
And then you just drive home at night and sleep in your own bed.
Right. And I think the unifying factor in all of these things is the concept of service, and quite possibly the concept of, hey, I'm going to test myself, right? The difference is that everybody's individual experience, whether you talk to Toby or your friend Blake or myself, is that even if we all went overseas at the same time, even though Toby and I shared a room together, his experience is going to be fundamentally different than my experience. And whether or not we come back with a satisfaction over whether or not we've sort of met the challenge that we anticipated, or that we still feel like there's something that needs to be done, either in terms of testing yourself out or in terms of service to your fellow man, is something that I think is still the big question that remains.
So Toby wanted me to ask you a question. He said, make sure you ask Nick about what was the ride like being on a ship to Iraq. And he also said, make sure and ask Nick about Lieutenant Schwartz.
Perfect. So the ride over to Iraq on the ship was pretty interesting for me. There were 3 major ships in this battle group that Marines were assigned to, right? We floated for, I think, about, a month, a good month at least, before we arrived in Kuwait, and then eventually convoyed up to Iraq. But to me, it was an opportunity to spend a lot of time with my Marines individually, because as a manager of combat engineers, you know, I can operate my platoon as a full platoon, and we bring a lot to the table at that point. Or the colonel who was in charge of our battalion ended up farming out a lot of my Marines to his own individual units and providing mobility for those guys in the field, which kind of left me like, I'm just sort of the advisor to the boss now, right? And I'm not left, you know, leading my guys and essentially facing the music with them right next to them, shoulder to shoulder, as would have been my desire. The nice part about being on ship was I had almost, I would say, a good month to like provide them with some last minute training, advice, ideology, which hopefully helped get them through. But also, you know, I got to be away from, we call it being away from the flag a little bit, where I wasn't under the watchful eye of the command staff 100% of the time. And so I could conduct training and really sort of morale boosting for my Marines as I saw fit. Whereas when we actually got to Iraq, you know, they were sort of farmed out, and I was like, I was sort of a man without a cause for a little while. But the ride over was bumpy at parts. You know, there were some pretty heavy seas, which I'd done a good bit of time on boats previously, whether through the Naval Academy or just my own personal interest. And so a lot of people tended to get sick, where I was sort of riding it like a roller coaster. But so from time to time, they would take me via helicopter from my small boat and transfer me over to the big boat, at which point it was kind of like, okay, Big Brother's watching, and you get dragged into these meetings and you would stand watch. You know, there are constant updates that we were trying to update ourselves with as a battalion landing team to make sure we had an accurate intel situation when we did land in Iraq, which, you know, the threat there was constantly evolving. And so these watches, I believe, were about 4 hours long, and I was scheduled to stand mine in the middle of the night, I think from probably, you know, 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. After which, you know, I was looking at the rotation, the schedule, and there was a guy named Lieutenant Schwartz who was designated to relieve me. And I was like, man, that's funny. I know I'm a new guy to this battalion, but I don't know Lieutenant Schwartz that exists. And I think it was the senior enlisted that had written the scheduling. This guy's name was not even close to Schwartz. It started with S. That was about as close as it got. But he tried to spell it out phonetically, and it just ended up being Schwartz. And I was like, well, certainly Schwartz knows that he's scheduled to come relieve me, right? And it rolls around to about 2 a.m. I'm looking at my watch, you know, just bleary-eyed, full of coffee, trying to stay awake. 2:30, 2:45, and it's like, well, clearly either Schwartz doesn't know he's supposed to be here or he doesn't exist. So I got to stand back to back, you know, in the middle of the night, and just ended up being completely exhausted the next day because this guy, Lieutenant Schwartz, didn't exist. But long story short, you know, shit always hits the fan overseas, and it's like, whose fault is it? it's fucking Schwartz again, you know? Sorry if I'm not allowed to curse on the podcast, but yeah, Schwartz was the scapegoat
That's
for
okay.
everything.
Yeah. Well, that's hilarious. So what is it? I'm always curious to know, and I think a lot of our listeners are curious to know, when you're heading into a combat zone, like when you get to Kuwait and then you convoy up to Iraq, like what's going through your mind? What kind of emotions do you have? Are you excited? Are you nervous? Combination of the two? Like what are you thinking about, man?
It's a combination of everything. It's a ton of nerves. Even before we got off ship, I remember myself, like I just remember my extremities shaking, and I had to physically grab them and hold them down, just because I was like, man, what is this going to be like? And I think in part the emotions are so high just because the stakes are so high. And it doesn't matter what my previous experience had been, whether it was working with explosives or shooting weapons or, you know, high level of athletic engagement. It doesn't prepare you because the stakes aren't present, or at least they don't seem as present. And so it's just a mixture of emotions of, you know, hopefulness that you'll kind of meet up to the expectations you have for yourself, that your crew will meet your expectations and that you'll meet theirs. I think fear. I think if you're not afraid of armed combat, then there's probably something wrong with you.
Something wrong with you, for sure. Yeah. I mean, you guys don't want I would think you would be a little nervous about having Marines that have no fear, that want to go in there and kill as many people as they can. Like, that's not what you're looking for.
Yeah. And you know, I think even if you do get that, I think a lot of the times it's just bravado.
Sure.
I think it's a brave face, or maybe an attitude that's perpetuated by an environment or a culture that wants guys to be tough and macho. But I mean, the amazing thing about it is that about 50% of the Marine Corps is Lance Corporal or below, which means that most of these guys
really are
under the age of probably 23. You know, probably the majority of enlisted Marines are under the age of 24.
Wow.
And this is, again, just me ballparking. I don't know the actual statistics, but we're literally going over to other countries and affecting our will overseas with a bunch of teenagers and young 20-somethings. And that's really amazing if you think about it.
Yeah, that is amazing. And, you know, in some ways, I think just from a psychological standpoint, once you get to be, you know, in your mid-20s or your late 20s or even your early 30s, you start getting married, you have kids, you just can't think and do the same things you can do when you're 20 years old, right? Like when you're a 20-year-old athlete, Nick, and I know you know what this feels like, you feel like you could do anything. Yeah. I mean, you feel indestructible, right?
Absolutely. I wish I still could.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I try to play basketball with my son now, and I'm like, man, I'll tell you what, the problem is my brain still tells me I can do things that my body can't do anymore.
That's right. That's right. I'm right there with you.
So
but I think the interesting thing, though, is that, you know, I had a platoon of about 40 combat engineers with me, and I wasn't very senior to them as far as, you know, years under my belt. I think I was 28 at the time that we actually deployed. But at the same time, the emotional and mental maturity level, because, again, I don't think you can – it's a very difficult expectation to have of a 17 or 18-year-old for them to have an appropriate emotional and mental response to a situation that is really, I mean, armed combat is in conflict with, I think, what our natural inclination is as human beings. And to expect them to have a, you know, even a healthy emotional response is a pretty big expectation. So I felt like that was a lot of my role as really the officer that was responsible for really working on behalf of these guys and helping them to realize, because again, I still had to struggle with squaring myself away with the reasons that we went to Iraq in the first place, but helping these guys realize, hey, what is the ideology behind why you're going? Can I help you in determining why it is that you're here and what makes you feel better about being here and being part of this unit and doing the missions that we're charged with doing? And ultimately, I think that was my primary job when I was overseas.
And Nick, you did one tour in Iraq?
One tour.
And you were wounded
I was.
In Iraq. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Not at all. And I apologize because I actually have a follow-on medical appointment that I got to leave for in about 20 minutes.
Perfect. We'll
as
be
a
done by
result
then.
of some of
Yeah.
those injuries. But I can follow up with you at a later date if you like. We were in the Battle of Fallujah, Part 2. There was an initial one in the spring, and then again in the fall, and we were incorporated into the offensive in the fall. At which point, again, my platoon was actually reunited as an entire platoon, and so I was able to utilize them in the capacity that I'd been trained to as a lieutenant. Now I'd been promoted to captain at this point, but was really grateful for the opportunity to have all those guys together. But we were providing mobility for Marine infantry units moving forward into the assault into the city in order to retake the city. And during one of our routine patrols, we met enemy resistance out on the street, got into a firefight with them. And then I was shot through, I guess, what you would call the abdominal cavity, but I had a 7.62 round enter my right hip and exit through kind of like my upper left butt cheek area.
So that happens. What's going through your mind? I mean, tell us. You had to get taken immediately to the medic, or?
So we had a corpsman embedded in our unit. He's a great guy and a great medic. Obviously, you can only do so much for a gunshot wound in the field. But immediately when I was shot, I was like, oh man, I know this isn't good. You know, the sensation is one that I can't really describe. It felt like getting hit by a baseball bat. But I immediately I sort of dropped to my knees and onto my face, and I was kind of in the dirt. And I remember testing my legs to make sure that they still worked, because it felt like I got hit in the back. And I was so grateful that my legs still worked, but I knew I was kind of in trouble. I was probably conscious for, I mean, time distorts itself over this long, trying to remember back, but probably about another 10, 15 minutes, at which point a couple of my Marines kind of hefted me up under their arms, took me back into an armored vehicle that we had. They patched me up as best I could. My corpsman said, hey, sir, you got to sit on it. I know it doesn't feel good, but you got to sit on it. Because the wound on my upper left butt cheek area was where all the blood was coming out. And so I sat on it, tried to put pressure on the dressing that he had applied. I gave my mouth.
That was the exit wound?
That was the exit wound, yep.
Yeah.
And then provided my CO, who had picked me up in the medevac vehicle, with the map of where we had engaged the enemy, and that's about all that I remember. At that point, I think I went into shock. They transported me to a number of different bases in Iraq, where I received a lot of critical care. Again, to Germany, and then from Germany to Bethesda, Maryland, which is where I ended up essentially waking up about 2 weeks later.
So I was going to ask you, after your shot, you pass on essentially the plans to your commanding officer, and then you don't have any memory what your next memory was, or your next clear memory.
So I was in a drug-induced coma for a couple of weeks. I have scattered memories after that point. I remember kind of coming around, and I was very out of it. My next I don't know if this is good for your listenership or not, but one of my next lucid memories was of a male nurse applying like a salve or a balm to my groin area, because my scrotum had swelled up so much. It was like the size of a couple of Texas grapefruits, due to the amount of blood flow that had just pooled there. But he was trying to prevent them from chafing and doing whatever else they were doing. And I was kind of coming around at that point. I was like, oh man, this is not the best experience.
This is not the way I wanted to wake up.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I had a fellow on the podcast, Dunton, who, when he was 20, got paralyzed. He jumped into the Rio Grande River in Texas and got paralyzed from the neck down. And he described his experience similar to yours, in that for about a month, he said it was almost like what a hallucinogenic trip would be like. Like, he doesn't have he has some memories, but not a lot of clear memories. So was it back in Bethesda when you first started kind of coming out of this? And
it was, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit, and hopefully it'll offer some perspective on, number one, my concept of, stability versus change, and kind of like the new normal, which is a term that's getting thrown out a lot lately, but also might offer some perspective on just maybe some concepts of resilience that I think are really important as they relate to change and stability.
Yeah.
2 years prior to that, and after 9/11, but just prior to my entire battalion deploying to Iraq, I injured my hands. It was a training accident right here on board Camp Pendleton. I'll kind of show you my hands, but I'm missing the fingertips of all but the pinky on this left hand here, and then a lot of the fingers here on the right hand. I won't bore you with the micro details, other than to tell you that it was kind of one of those Swiss cheese model accidents where there were probably 20 different things that went wrong with this training range that ultimately led to my injury. It was a pretty disheartening injury for myself. Number one, because it meant that I wouldn't be able to deploy with my Marines, because I knew that a deployment was coming. And this was, again, the opportunity to test myself, to see if my Marines met the test, and really to validate all the training that we had done. But number two, because my injury was partly of my own making. Like, there were mistakes in that Swiss cheese model that I was responsible for. And it was really hard for me. Frankly, and I even still describe it as a bit professionally embarrassing. As someone who places a really high degree of confidence and pride in the work that I do. And so I almost felt like I was walking around with this stigma of, man, that guy screwed it up, right? And a lot of the rules of the range are written in blood. And I had a really hard time coming to terms with the fact that, number one, I was dealing with what some might consider a physical disability, and number two, I was partly responsible for it. I'd be lying to you if I told you that I wasn't down in the dumps and having a bit of a pity party for myself after it happened.
For sure.
What was interesting about the subsequent injury that I had, which was almost 2 years to the day following my hand injury, was that I was almost kind of primed for that kind of need for resilience. And even though the injury was different, the concept of facing an injury like that was something that was entirely within my wheelhouse. And I felt like not only was my mental outlook one of positivity, which I feel like your podcast and just your outlook on life really champion, and which I'm a huge champion of as well. But my ability to recognize that there is no such thing as a normal. Whatever the new normal is just going to be what is, right? And my ability to look to that and then be a positive agent of change for my own recovery was so much better now that my perspective was one of, hey, I need to bear down and influence the factors that I can influence. And the other factors that I can't influence, I have no influence over, and I have to let them go.
Nick, that reminds, so my mother died when I was 10 and my brother was 8. My dad was a major in the Air Force at the time. And she died. Well, I appreciate you saying that. She had a very difficult struggle with breast cancer for about 5 years. Lost her hair, double mastectomies, multiple broken hips. It was really tough. But looking back on it, it has, I think, steeled me or given me some resolve. It's given me two things. Number one, it's made me realize that life is short. And so, you're better off looking at things from the most positive perspective you can than the most negative way you can. But the other thing it taught me, I think, is resilience. And like you're talking about, and I got to ask you, Nick, so for people that are just listening to this on the podcast and not watching on YouTube, Nick held up both his hands. And on one hand, he has essentially one finger and part of a thumb. And on the other hand, he has essentially half or kind of a third of the finger. So people, if you can get that image in your head. Nick, I got to ask you, how was it with that kind of injury? Were you able to stay in the Marine Corps? Because a lot of people that get injured like that, you're not going to combat. So
sure.
How were you able to?
They
get
put me
over that
before
injury?
what's called so what they did was, and again, there are physical standards that you have to meet in the Marine Corps as well. And they put me before what's called the Medical Review Board. And the convening authority on this was a guy who was an orthopedic surgeon. And basically it was his job to test the functionality of my hand and really to determine if I wanted to stay. And of course, I wanted to stay, not only because I felt like the concept of service that I had intended to join up for in the first place hadn't been fulfilled or realized yet, but also because I hadn't I hadn't gone through the challenge that I felt like I needed to, in order to say, hey, I've got what it takes. My mettle has been tested.
And 9/11 had happened by this time, and then you have this training injury, a severe training injury,
right.
and you could have, if you wanted to, use that as a way to get out of the military, and nobody would have ever criticized you for it.
Right.
Nobody would. People would have totally understood. But it sounds like you made a different decision. You said, I don't care about these injuries. I'm going to stay in with my team, and I'm going to go to combat. Is that basically how it happened?
Yeah. So I didn't know if the opportunity to go to combat was going to present itself again or not. But the idea that I would not be capable of doing the things that I felt like I should be able to do as a Marine, as a man, as a human, just didn't sit well with me. And so this convening authority, who was a great guy, by the way, I don't remember his name, but asked me basically, hey, can you still shoot a rifle? Can you still do pull-ups? Can you do all the things that are required of you as a Marine Corps officer? And I set out during my rehabilitation period to prove that I could. And right around the time that I met Toby was when I was teaching myself how to do pull-ups essentially with one finger on my right hand. And I've since learned how to incorporate like the portion of my index finger that's still capable of doing that. And I was able to do all the things that I needed to. And so, ultimately I decided to stay. And this convening authority was kind enough and recognized, I think, my desire and capability enough to allow me to stay.
So Nick, that's awesome. And I would think, that you being a high level athlete probably helped too, because you probably have enough hand-eye coordination and physical strength and dexterity that maybe somebody that doesn't have those physical capabilities wouldn't be able to do what you were able to do. So certainly being athletic probably helped you deal with that situation. Well, Nick, I'm mindful of your time. You got 5 or 10 more minutes?
Yeah, about, I'd say 6 or 7 minutes.
Okay, perfect. That's perfect. So I really wanted to spend a lot of time talking about your work as a firefighter, and we're not going to have time to do that. Maybe we can get you on later and we can just talk about your work as a firefighter, because I'm super interested in that, like super, super interested. But in the last 5 minutes or so, what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is I'd like to hear kind of your perspective as somebody who's been through some really hard times in war, been injured twice, has had to overcome some things, and has probably seen some very, very tragic things as well. What are you telling people now that you work with about how we can deal with these times that are, this pandemic is so big, it affects literally everybody in the world. There's so much uncertainty. Then we have the protests, we have the economy, and it's just a real hard time for people. So I think people would love to hear from a Marine Corps officer who's dealt with these kind of really, really trying situations. Like, what are you telling people?
Certainly. Well, first I'll say that there's a concept of resilience that you and I have both kind of referred back to. And I think by the definition of resilience, it's essentially returning to a shape that you've already been in, right? And whether that's recovering from an injury or the loss of a loved one. And if it hasn't happened to you personally, it's going to happen. At some point in your life, it necessarily will happen. And that's kind of how it happened to me. I had a great upbringing, never suffered any significant loss. Really everything was kind of laid out for me, and it was up to me to go out and take it. And then experience some setbacks, right? In terms of, multiple significant physical injuries, in terms of most recently the loss of our daughter, which, we're still, and I think probably always will be dealing with.
For sure.
And so there's a concept of resilience that we will get through this. And with the initial injury to my hands, again, it was one that promoted in me the understanding that, hey, none of this is going to get better unless I make it better. And I have to be a positive agent of change, not only at my own level, but hopefully for other people, right? And which I think is, to a large degree, why you're doing this podcast. Yeah. There's the concept of post-traumatic growth, which I think goes a step beyond resilience.
I love this concept. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
post-traumatic growth, in contrast to resilience, is that, yes, you've recovered and returned to your original shape. Much like I did, I would say, with this situation with my hand injury, where I returned to a state of physical readiness where I was able to do pull-ups and shoot a rifle, utilizing a different technique, but in the same manner that I was able to before. The post-traumatic growth portion of that was that now I was, what I like to say, primed to suffer additional injuries. Again, these injuries are going to happen. And that's not to say don't enjoy the good things in life. And hopefully it allows you to enjoy the good things more. But it also allows you to realize that with these setbacks, and whether they're setbacks of personal injury or loss of family or friends, or in the case that we're in now, right, civil unrest, COVID-19, the economy, whatever, that these things are changeable. And I know a lot of people are having a hard time seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. And in the case, like you were talking about, of your son who's in high school, and, we're not going to go back to living in a world that looks like it did before these times.
That's right.
You know what? We don't have any influence over that. What we do have influence over is to do the things that we can do to the best of our ability, to provide the services, whether that's service, on a national scale. If you're one of these researchers who's developing a vaccine and going through clinical trials, and this is something that's going to affect the well-being of humankind, terrific. I don't have the propeller of a brain that allows me to do that kind of thing. The things, again, that drive me are things that I think affect change locally, right? The things that drive me have always been, athleticism, teamwork, testing myself in these high stress, mental and physical capacities. And again, that's led me to a career as a firefighter. And that's the service that I provide back, along with some other things that maybe we can talk about later. But find those things that turn your wheel. Recognize that things are going to change. Even after the COVID-19 thing has kind of washed through and we are living whatever the new normal is, guess what? That new normal isn't going to be our new normal forever either. There's going to be something else that changes either us as humankind or you personally as an individual. To experience that post-traumatic growth, we need to learn as much as we can from this COVID situation and really analyze whatever other situations of loss or injury that you've had in your life, and realize, how do I turn these to good? How do I turn these to the betterment, not only of myself, but to my family, to my coworkers, to my friends? And really, if I want to affect change at a local level, at a global level, how do I best do that? And I think your message of positivity is one that it allowed me to heal faster, whether it's from the loss of our daughter, whether it was from my gunshot wound. A positive mental attitude has played a significant and I think very measurable role, not only in my physical recovery, but my psychological recovery. And I guess that would be the lasting message that I would send to people. And I think with the realization that, the old saying, this too shall pass. I think with the recognition that this is not forever, but there are things that we can do now to influence the outcome for ourselves, for our families, for people that we care about, is a huge lesson to take away. And I think it's the most important takeaway that we've got nowadays.
Well put, Marine. Well put. Well, I've been telling my family, I've been saying, we just got to be mentally flexible. We have to be willing to kind of roll with the punches. There's a great book, Nick, and you've referenced this concept multiple times in the podcast. There's a great book called Anti-Fragile by an author named Nicholas Nassim Taleb. And the concept is really simple. He says, basically, there's three kinds of systems. There's fragile systems, which break easily. There's robust systems, which don't break easily, but they eventually break. And then there's systems that actually get stronger with stress. So like, the obvious example is when you lift weights or something, you're literally putting stress and you're tearing your muscles, and then they end up getting stronger and building stronger. Mm-hmm. And so this concept of resilience, it's the same thing as resilience, anti-fragility. There's a famous saying, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. It's kind of that concept. And so I love the way you put that, because now is the time. We basically have two options, Nick. We can feel sorry for ourselves, and we can be upset and depressed, and we can be part of all the negativity, or we can say, we're going to use this to get better, stronger. We're going to get better prepared for pandemics. We're going to get we're going to do what we need to do with the police and some of the minority communities. And we can make things better. These are opportunities right now. We have opportunities to make our community and our country better. And so, Nick, I want to thank you so much for being a part of that. Thanks for being on the podcast. Thanks for spending a little extra time with me. And I should have said this at the beginning, and I know you hear this all the time, but I feel like I need to say it anyway. Thank you for your service to our country.
Oh, thank you for saying so. It's always nice to hear, and I know you genuinely appreciate it. And thank you for what you do as well. I really appreciate being with you.
Yeah, man, for sure. And I'm serious. Maybe in a couple of months we can get you back on and we can talk about being a firefighter, because that is super cool, man. I would love to hear about that.
Let's do it. Let's do it. I would love to. And I apologize for having to cut you guys short today, but I do need to get to this appointment. And again, I really appreciate you having me for the time that you have had me.
Thank you, brother.
All right. We'll talk to you soon, Brian.
All right. Take care.
You too.
Bye.
You've been listening to Lessons from Leaders with Brian Beckcom. If you've enjoyed this week's interview, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast and keep up with the latest episodes. You can also connect with Brian through his firm at vbattorneys.com.